If my dog hadn't stopped digging that night, a powerful man would have died 10 feet from the road, and I never would have known how close my quiet life was to breaking open. I remember the cold first. That sharp November cold that creeps through the seams of your jacket and settles into your bones. It was just past 10:30 at night, and the narrow county road outside Cedar Hollow was empty except for my old Ford Explorer and the occasional sweep of headlights miles away on the highway. My son Ethan had fallen asleep in the back seat 20 minutes earlier, his small sneakers pressed against the door, his backpack sliding slowly with every turn of the road. Bruno sat in the passenger seat beside me, all 150 pounds of Neapolitan Mastiff muscle and loose gray skin, breathing slow and steady like a living furnace. Normally he loved car rides. Normally he drooled on the window and watched the trees blur past like a curious old man. But that night something changed. It started with a low rumble in his chest. Not a bark, not a growl, just a deep vibration that made the cup holder rattle slightly. I glanced over. "What is it, Bruno?" His head lifted. His massive ears tilted forward. Then he sat up straighter than I'd ever seen him sit in a moving car. His eyes were fixed on the dark woods just beyond the shoulder of the road. I slowed the SUV without thinking. The beam of my headlights slid across wet gravel, tall weeds, and the first line of pine trees swaying quietly in the wind. Bruno let out a sudden sharp bark that made me jump. Ethan stirred behind me, but didn't wake. "Hey, easy," I whispered. But Bruno was already pushing his heavy head against the passenger door. I sighed and pulled the car onto the shoulder. Living out here teaches you one thing. When a dog like Bruno notices something, you pay attention. I shut off the engine. The silence rushed in. Just whined through the trees. Distant insects. And Bruno breathing hard beside me. I opened the door, and the cold air hit my face like ice water. Gravel crunched under my boots as I stepped out. Bruno jumped down beside me with a heavy thud and immediately turned toward the woods. "Don't go far," I murmured automatically, though Bruno had never wandered far from me in his life. He moved with surprising speed for such a massive dog, pushing through the weeds until he reached a small patch of disturbed ground about 15 yards from the road. Then he started digging. Not playful scratching. Digging. Violent, desperate digging that sent damp soil flying in every direction. "Bruno." I jogged toward him, heart already beginning to beat faster. "What did you find?" The smell of wet earth filled the cold air. Bruno's paws moved faster. Dirt piled behind him. I stepped closer, confused, maybe a little nervous, and that's when I saw it. At first it looked like a pale branch sticking out of the ground. But branches don't wear watches. My breath caught in my throat. Oh my God, it was a hand. A human hand, half buried in the soil, fingers barely visible beneath the mud. For one frozen second I couldn't move. My mind tried to explain it away. A mannequin. A Halloween prop. Anything but what it actually was. Then the fingers twitched. Just a tiny movement. But enough. My heart slammed against my ribs. "He's alive." The words left my mouth before I even realized I'd spoken them. Bruno stepped back, panting, watching me. I dropped to my knees in the dirt and started digging with my bare hands. I did not think about the cold anymore. I did not think about the dark woods or the empty road behind me. All I could think about was the hands sticking out of the dirt and the faint movement I had seen. My fingers plunged into the loose soil beside Bruno's freshly dug hole, scooping dirt away as fast as I could. The ground was damp from earlier rain, which helped, but it was still packed enough that my nails scraped painfully against small stones. Bruno hovered beside me, pacing in tight circles, his heavy breathing loud in the quiet night. "It is okay, boy," I whispered, though my voice was shaking. "We just need to help him." I brushed more dirt away from the arm until the wrist was fully exposed. The skin was pale and cold, but not stiff. The watch on his wrist was expensive, the kind you only see in jewelry store windows, the metal band scratched but still gleaming under the headlights from my car. That detail made my stomach twist. Whoever this man was, he was not someone who usually ended up buried in the woods beside a rural road. "Stay with me," I said under my breath, even though I was not sure he could hear me. I dug faster, pulling away handful after handful of soil. Within seconds my hands were coated in mud. My sleeves were wet up to my elbows. Slowly the shape of his arm appeared, then his shoulder beneath the dirt. He was lying on his side. I could see the edge of a dark jacket under the soil. The fabric was soaked and stiff with mud. "Bruno, back up a little," I murmured. The dog obeyed instantly, stepping away but keeping his huge body close enough that I could feel his warmth beside me. I kept digging until I reached the man's chest. The dirt there was heavier, packed down as if someone had pressed it firmly after covering him. My heart pounded harder as the realization settled in. Someone had done this deliberately. Someone had buried him here and walked away. I forced the thought aside. Right now, none of that mattered. Right now, the only thing that mattered was whether he could still breathe. I brushed the dirt away from his face as carefully as I could. Dark hair, matted with mud, came into view first. Then his forehead. His eyes were closed, his expression completely still. For a terrifying moment, I thought I had been wrong. Then I saw it. The smallest movement at his lips. A faint breath. Relief rushed through me so fast it made my head spin. "Okay," I whispered quickly. "You are still here." I cleared the soil away from his mouth and nose until the cool night air could reach him freely. Bruno lowered his giant head beside the man and sniffed carefully, his tail giving one slow, uncertain wag. The man's chest rose again, shallow but steady. I slipped my hands under his shoulder and tried to lift him, but he was far heavier than I expected. He must have been over 6 feet tall, built solid even beneath the layers of wet clothing. "Come on," I muttered, bracing my boots against the ground. "Help me out here." Bruno barked once sharply, as if he understood the urgency. I shifted my grip and pulled harder, dragging the man. Slowly upward through the loose dirt, Bruno had already moved. Inch by inch, his upper body slid free from the ground until he rolled onto the grass beside the hole. He lay there motionless under the cold night sky, breathing slowly, mud covering most of his jacket and shoulders. I leaned back on my heels, chest heaving, my hands trembling from the effort. The quiet of the woods returned around us. The wind stirred the pine trees overhead. My headlights cut a pale tunnel of light across the grass and gravel. For a few seconds, I just stared at the stranger lying beside the road, trying to understand how a normal drive home had turned into this moment. Then Bruno gave a low rumble in his throat again. The man's eyelids twitched slightly, and suddenly I realized something that made my pulse jump all over again. Whoever had left him here might not be very far away. I realized my hands were shaking. Not just a little. The kind of shaking that starts deep in your arms when adrenaline has nowhere left to go. The man lay on the damp grass beside the hole Bruno had uncovered, his chest rising slowly, each breath shallow but steady. For a moment I just watched him, trying to decide what to do next. Call 911. That was the normal answer. The responsible answer. But the quiet around us felt wrong. Too empty. Too exposed. Whoever had left him here had chosen this place for a reason. A narrow road. Thick woods. Hardly any traffic after dark. If they had buried him expecting him to disappear, they might come back to check. The thought made my stomach tighten. Bruno must have sensed the shift in me because he moved closer, his massive body pressing against my leg like a living wall. His deep brown eyes stayed fixed on the dark tree line. "You see something?" I whispered. Bruno did not bark this time. He just stared into the woods, his heavy jowls still, ears slightly forward. I forced myself to focus again on the man lying in front of me. Up close, he looked younger than I first thought. Maybe mid-30s. Strong features under the dirt and mud, dark hair thick and slightly wavy. A sharp jawline that made him look like he belonged in a business magazine instead of half. Buried in the ground outside a rural road. His coat was expensive. Not just nice. Expensive. The fabric was heavy wool, the kind that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill. Whoever he was, he came from a world very different than mine. I touched his shoulder carefully. "Hey," I said quietly. "Can you hear me?" No response. I leaned closer, checking his breathing again. Still there. Slow. Weak. But there. The cold air had already started to sink into his clothes, and the damp soil clung to him like cement. If he stayed out here much longer, the temperature alone could push him over the edge. I glanced toward my car parked 10 yards away on the gravel shoulder. The dome light glowed faintly inside, illuminating the back seat where Ethan still slept, his small chest rising and falling peacefully. The sight of my son snapped something into place inside my mind. I could not leave this man here, but I also could not risk standing around on the side of the road waiting for an ambulance while my child sat unprotected in the car. I looked back down at the stranger. "All right," I murmured, more to myself than to him. "We are moving you." I slipped my arms under his shoulders and tried to lift again. His body shifted slightly, but barely left the ground. He was easily 200 pounds, maybe more. Okay, I muttered, breathing out slowly. New plan. Bruno watched me with calm attention. I need your help, big guy, I said softly. I grabbed the man beneath the arms and pulled, dragging him carefully across the damp grass toward the road. The mud made it easier than lifting, though every inch felt like pulling a full-grown tree. Bruno paced beside us, occasionally stepping ahead to look toward the woods before returning to my side. The gravel reached my knees at last. My arms burned. My back screamed in protest. But the man was closer to the car now. I paused to catch my breath and pushed damp hair out of my face. As I did, the stranger made a faint sound. Not a word, just a low breath that carried the slightest trace of awareness. I froze. Slowly, his eyelids lifted halfway. Dark eyes, unfocused and heavy with exhaustion, blinked once toward the night sky. For a split second those eyes found mine. Confused. Distant. But alive. His lips moved slightly. No sound came out. Then his eyes slipped closed again. My pulse jumped. That is right, I said quickly, steadying him before he rolled. Stay with me. I tightened my grip and pulled again, inching him toward the open back door of the Explorer. Whatever had happened to him, whatever danger might still be out here in the trees, one thing was clear now. This stranger was not supposed to survive tonight. The back door of the Explorer was still open, the dim interior light spilling onto the gravel like a small island in the dark. I tightened my grip under the stranger's arms and pulled again, inching him the last few feet across the shoulder of the road. My boots slipped once on the loose gravel, but I caught myself before losing balance. Bruno stayed close, his broad body shifting between me and the silent woods as if he understood exactly what I was trying to do. Just a little more, I whispered through clenched teeth. The man's coat scraped against the edge of the gravel and then against the rubber mat inside the back of the vehicle. That small sound felt impossibly loud in the still night. I paused, breathing hard, my arms trembling from the effort. The stranger lay halfway inside the car now, his shoulders resting on the floor behind the front seats. Ethan was still asleep on the opposite side of the back seat, curled against the window with his jacket pulled up like a blanket. For a second, panic flashed through me. I had to move carefully. I could not wake him. Not yet. Not until I understood what was happening. I slid one hand beneath the stranger's shoulder and lifted again, guiding his weight slowly onto the back seat floor. Bruno watched the entire movement without making a sound, his dark eyes flicking between the trees and the man now inside the vehicle. Finally, the stranger's full weight shifted into the car. His legs still hung partly out the door, but at least he was no longer lying exposed beside the road. I stepped back and wiped my muddy hands against my jeans, my chest rising and falling fast. The cold air bit through the sweat on my skin. Okay, I whispered to myself. Okay, think. Calling emergency services still sat at the front of my mind like a blinking light. But something about the situation felt wrong. Whoever had buried this man had done it quietly, carefully. They had chosen a place where almost nobody passed at night. If people like that existed, if they believed their plan had worked, what would happen if flashing lights suddenly appeared out here? My gaze drifted back toward the dark woods. The branches swayed gently in the wind, but nothing moved between them. Still, the uneasy feeling refused to leave my chest. Bruno stepped forward and placed one huge paw against the door frame, leaning slightly inside the vehicle. He sniffed the stranger once more, his nose brushing the man's sleeve, then looked up at me. His expression almost seemed patient, as if he was waiting for my next decision. I reached down and checked the stranger's breathing again. It was still shallow but steadier than before. The warmth inside the car might help him recover some strength. You picked the strangest night to show up in my life, I murmured quietly. His face was clearer now under the dome light. Even with dirt across his cheekbones and mud in his hair, the man carried a presence that was hard to ignore. Not arrogance. Not exactly. Something else. The quiet confidence of someone used to being listened to. Someone used to being in control. The thought made me uneasy. Ethan shifted in his sleep behind him, mumbling something soft before settling again. Instinctively, I reached over and pulled my son's backpack farther away from the stranger's shoulder so nothing would press against him. The stranger's eyelids fluttered again, just barely, but he did not wake. All right, I said softly, closing the door halfway before Bruno climbed back into the passenger seat. I walked around to the driver's side and slid behind the wheel. My hands left faint streaks of dirt across the steering wheel as I started the engine. The headlights washed across the empty road ahead. The woods behind us remained silent. I took one more look into the rearview mirror. The stranger lay stretched across the floor of the back seat, breathing slowly in the warm glow of the cabin light. Ethan slept inches away, completely unaware that a man pulled from a shallow grave was now riding home with us. I tightened my grip on the wheel and eased the Explorer back onto the road. Whatever trouble this stranger carried with him, it was already inside my car. The road out of Cedar Hollow wound through miles of dark trees, and that night every curve felt longer than usual. I kept both hands tight on the steering wheel as the Explorer rolled forward, the headlights cutting a pale tunnel through the quiet forest. The tires hummed softly against the asphalt, the only steady sound inside the vehicle besides the slow breathing coming from the back seat. For several minutes I drove without speaking, without even turning on the radio. My thoughts kept circling the same question. Who was the man lying behind me? In the rearview mirror, I could see part of his shoulder rising and falling with each breath. Mud still covered most of his coat, leaving faint smears across the floor mat. The interior heater had begun to warm the cabin, and the air inside the car slowly lost that sharp cold smell from outside. Ethan shifted again in his sleep, rubbing his face against the sleeve of his hoodie before settling back into the corner of the seat. The sight eased a small knot in my chest. At least he was still sleeping. Bruno sat upright in the passenger seat like a statue, his massive head turned slightly toward the back of the car. Every few seconds his eyes flicked to the stranger and then back to the windshield, as if he had appointed himself the official guard of the vehicle. "You did good tonight," I murmured quietly to him. His thick tail thumped once against the seat. Another mile passed beneath the tires before something changed behind me. It started as a small shift of fabric, then a faint sound, like someone pulling in a deeper breath after a long sleep. My eyes moved to the mirror again. The stranger's head had turned slightly to one side. His brow tightened, as if the simple act of breathing required effort. A moment later his eyes opened. Only halfway at first, unfocused and heavy, like someone waking from a dream they could not quite leave behind. I felt my pulse jump. "Easy," I said softly, keeping my voice calm. "Do not try to move." For a second his gaze drifted across the roof of the vehicle, then toward the glow of the dashboard lights. Finally his eyes reached the mirror and met mine through the reflection. They were darker than I expected, alert even through exhaustion. The look lasted only a second before confusion replaced it. His lips moved slightly, forming words that barely carried any sound. I could not make out what he tried to say. "You are safe," I told him quietly. "Just stay still." The stranger blinked slowly, as if trying to understand the situation. His gaze shifted toward the side of the seat where Ethan slept. Something changed in his expression then. Not fear, not exactly surprise, more like careful awareness. He looked back toward the front again, studying the interior of the car with the calm attention of someone used to reading a room very quickly. Even in his weakened state, there was something deliberate in the way his eyes moved. Bruno let out a low breath through his nose, but did not growl. He simply watched. The stranger tried to push himself up slightly, and immediately stopped, his strength clearly not ready for that kind of effort. I heard a faint exhale from him before his head settled back against the seat edge. "Do not worry about talking yet," I said. "You were in the ground for who knows how long. Just breathe." For a few seconds the only sound inside the Explorer was the quiet rhythm of the engine and the wind brushing against the windows. Then the stranger spoke again, his voice rough and quiet, but clearer this time. "Where are we?" The question came slowly, each word measured. I kept my eyes on the road as the next bend in the highway approached. "About 15 minutes from my place," I answered calmly. "You are riding in my car because my dog found you buried beside the road." Silence followed that statement. Long enough that I wondered if he had lost consciousness again. Then I heard a faint breath that almost sounded like disbelief. In the mirror his eyes had not closed. They were watching me carefully now, as if the man in the back seat had suddenly realized that the night had taken a turn he never expected. I could feel his eyes on the back of my head after that. Not the unfocused stare of someone drifting in and out of consciousness. This was different. Quiet. Calculating. the kind of attention that made the space inside the car feel suddenly smaller. The road curved gently through another stretch of dark pine trees, and I slowed a little as the tires passed over a patch of uneven pavement. "You should not be awake yet," I said calmly, keeping my eyes forward. But I guess the night already stopped following normal rules. For a moment he did not answer. In the mirror, I saw him study the interior of the Explorer again, taking in the worn upholstery, the plastic dinosaur sticker on the back of the passenger seat that Ethan had placed there 2 years ago, the scattered crayons on the floor mat. His gaze paused when it reached Ethan. My son had rolled slightly onto his side, one hand tucked beneath his cheek, breathing slow and steady. The stranger watched him for several seconds without speaking. Then his eyes moved toward Bruno in the passenger seat. Bruno did not look back immediately. He sat facing the windshield like a silent guard, though one ear tilted backward as if listening closely. "That is your dog," the man said finally, his voice still rough but steadier than before. "Yes," I replied. "His name is Bruno. He is the reason you are still breathing tonight." The words hung quietly between us. I watched the mirror again. A faint line formed between his brows, as if he was piecing together the memory of what had happened before he lost consciousness. "He dug me out," the man said slowly. "He found you." I corrected gently. "I did the digging." For a second something almost like disbelief crossed his face. Then it faded behind a calmer expression. He tried to shift again and immediately stopped, the small movement clearly taking more strength than he had available. Bruno turned his head then, meeting the stranger's eyes directly. There was no growl, no tension, just a long, steady look between two creatures measuring each other. "He does not seem afraid of you," the man murmured quietly. I let out a small breath. Bruno does not scare easily. The headlights swept across a wooden road sign that marked the turnoff toward the small dirt lane leading to my cabin. I flicked the blinker and guided the Explorer onto the narrower road. Gravel replaced pavement beneath the tires with a soft crunch. The woods closed in closer here, the branches arching slightly over the path like a tunnel of shadows. The stranger noticed the change immediately. His gaze shifted toward the windows, scanning the darkness outside. Even exhausted, he seemed alert in a way that felt unusual. "Where are you taking me?" he asked. "My place," I answered simply. "It is the closest safe place with heat and running water." Another pause followed. I could almost feel the questions forming in his mind. Finally he spoke again. "You do not know who I am." It was not a question. I shook my head slightly. "No, and right now that does not matter." The gravel road curved once more, and the faint glow of a porch light appeared through the trees ahead. My small cabin stood at the end of the path, quiet and still, the warm yellow bulb above the door cutting a soft circle into the night. I slowed the Explorer and pulled to a stop beside the steps. The engine hummed for a second before I turned the key, and the sound faded away. Silence filled the clearing. I glanced into the rearview mirror one more time. The stranger was watching the house carefully now, as if evaluating it the way someone might study a map. "You saved a man you do not know," he said quietly. I opened the driver's door, and the cold night air rushed in again. "No," I replied over my shoulder as I stepped out onto the gravel. "My dog did that. I just refused to leave you in the ground." I walked around the front of the Explorer, the gravel crunching under my boots, and opened the back door slowly so the interior light would not suddenly wake Ethan. The warm glow spilled across the seat and over the stranger lying on the floor behind it. For a moment he simply watched me, those dark eyes calmer now, but still sharp with quiet awareness. "All right," I said softly. "We need to get you inside." He looked toward the open door, and then toward the cabin porch light glowing through the trees. The small building probably looked nothing like the places he was used to. Weathered wood siding, a narrow set of steps, and a rocking chair that had belonged to my father sitting beside the door. Simple, quiet, safe. "Can you stand?" I asked. The stranger considered the question for a moment before answering honestly. "Not yet." His voice had grown. Steadier, but it still carried the strain of someone who had been through far more than his body wanted to explain. I nodded once. "Then we do this the slow way." Bruno jumped down from the passenger seat and landed beside me with a heavy thud, immediately positioning himself between the dark woods and the open car door. I reached carefully inside the vehicle and slid one arm beneath the stranger's shoulders again. "On 3, I murmured. "You push a little if you can." His eyes narrowed slightly as he gathered what strength he had left. 1, 2, 3. I pulled while he tried to brace himself against the seat. The movement was awkward, but enough to slide him partway upright. His boots touched the gravel, and for a moment he remained leaning heavily against the door frame, breathing slowly as if adjusting to the cold air again. Bruno watched him closely but remained calm. "Take your time," I said quietly. The stranger nodded once, then shifted his weight forward. For a second I thought he might collapse again, but he steadied himself against my shoulder instead. He was taller than I expected, easily over 6 feet, and even weakened his presence felt solid and controlled. Together we moved slowly toward the cabin steps. Each step across the gravel took effort, but he did not complain or rush. When we reached the porch he paused again, one hand resting lightly against the wooden railing as he looked at the quiet clearing around us. The woods stood still. The night carried only the sound of wind through the branches. Finally he stepped inside the small circle of light from the porch lamp. I opened the door and guided him into the living room. The warmth from the space heater drifted across the room immediately. A worn couch sat against the far wall beside a small coffee table scattered with Ethan's schoolbooks. The stranger took it all in with one steady glance before lowering himself carefully onto the couch with my help. The moment he sat down, his shoulders relaxed slightly, as if the simple act of being indoors allowed his body to release a fraction of the tension it had been carrying. Bruno entered right behind us and positioned himself near the door like a silent guard again. I turned back toward the car, remembering Ethan still sleeping in the back seat. "Do not move," I told the stranger gently. "I will bring my son inside." He studied me for a brief moment, then gave a small nod. When I returned with Ethan wrapped in his blanket, the stranger watched quietly as I carried my son to the bedroom down the hall. Ethan barely stirred as I tucked him into bed. By the time I stepped back into the living room, the stranger was still sitting exactly where I left him, his hands resting loosely against his knees, his eyes following the small movements of Bruno pacing across the wooden floor. The room remained quiet for several seconds before he finally spoke again. "You trust strangers more than most people." I leaned against the doorway, studying him under the warm lamplight. "No," I replied calmly. "I trust my dog." "And Bruno decided you deserved a chance to breathe." I stayed in the doorway for a moment after saying that, watching the stranger the same way he had been studying the room. The cabin was quiet except for the low hum of the space heater and the faint creak of old wood settling in the night air. Bruno walked across the floor and lowered himself beside the couch, his massive head resting on his paws, but his eyes still open, still alert. The stranger noticed that too. "Your dog guards the door like a soldier," he said quietly. I shrugged slightly and pushed myself away from the wall. "He guards Ethan," I replied. "The door just happens to be nearby." I moved into the small kitchen area and filled a glass with warm water from the kettle that still sat on the stove. The simple routine steadied my nerves. When I returned to the living room, the stranger had shifted slightly on the couch, sitting a little straighter though the effort clearly cost him. I handed him the glass. "Sip slowly," I said. "Your body is still catching up." He accepted the glass carefully, his fingers steady despite everything he had been through. He drank a small amount and then paused, as if letting the warmth settle before taking another sip. For a few seconds neither of us spoke. The room felt calmer now that the immediate rush of the night had passed, but the questions still hovered quietly between us. Finally he lowered the glass and looked at me. "You still have not asked my name." I leaned against the arm of the chair across from him. "That is true." His gaze held mine, patient but watchful. "Most people would have asked already. Most people would have called emergency services and waited beside the road," I replied calmly. Tonight stopped being normal a while ago. That answer seemed to interest him. He studied my face for a moment before nodding slightly. "Adrian," he said. "My name is Adrian." The name settled into the quiet room. It sounded strong, confident, like it belonged to someone used to introducing himself in places far larger than my small cabin. "Claire," I answered. "And the boy sleeping down the hall is Ethan." Adrian's eyes moved briefly toward the hallway before returning to me. "You protected him tonight," he said quietly. "Most parents would have left a stranger beside the road rather than bring him near their child." I folded my arms loosely, thinking about that. "Maybe," I said. But leaving someone in the ground did not feel like the right lesson to teach my son. Bruno lifted his head slightly at the sound of my voice, then relaxed again. Adrian watched the dog for a moment and then looked back at me. You understand that the situation you stepped into may not be simple. The way he said the word simple carried weight. I held his gaze without flinching. I understood that the moment I saw the watch on your wrist. That surprised him just enough that the corner of his mouth moved in a faint hint of a smile. Observant, he said quietly. I walked to the cabinet and pulled out a small first aid kit, placing it on the coffee table. Observant enough to know that someone who ends up buried in the woods probably has a complicated story, I said. But right now your story can wait. I opened the kit and began setting out clean cloth and antiseptic. Right now we focus on getting you warm and steady again. Adrian leaned back slightly against the couch, watching me work with calm attention. The faint smile had faded, but the respect in his eyes had not. After a moment he spoke again, his voice quieter this time. Claire, he said slowly, testing the name as if committing it to memory. Tonight you gave a stranger a second chance to breathe. I met his gaze as I prepared the cloth. No, I answered softly. Tonight Bruno found someone who was not ready to leave yet. I dipped the clean cloth into the warm water and wrung it out slowly before stepping closer to the couch. Adrian watched every movement with the calm focus of someone who was used to noticing details. The lamp beside the sofa cast a soft amber light across the room, and in that quiet glow the dirt and dried mud across his coat looked even more out of place against the expensive fabric. This may sting a little, I said gently as I lifted the cloth toward the side of his forehead where a streak of dirt had hardened into a thin line. Adrian did not pull away. He remained still while I carefully wiped the soil from his skin, revealing a faint mark beneath it that looked more like exhaustion than injury. He breathed slowly through his nose, patient, as if he had decided to trust the moment without asking too many questions. Bruno lifted his head slightly when I stepped closer, his large eyes tracking my movements. But he relaxed again when Adrian did not react. The simple rhythm of cleaning the mud away felt grounding after everything that had happened outside. I moved carefully, working across Adrian's temple and along the edge of his jaw where the dirt had collected. Underneath the mud his skin was pale from the cold, but the color had already begun to return now that he was inside the warm cabin. You should sleep soon, I said quietly. Your body needs time to recover. Adrian glanced briefly toward the hallway where Ethan slept before returning his gaze to me. And you, he asked slowly, do you always bring strangers into your home at night? I smiled faintly at that. Only the ones my dog digs out of the ground. That earned a quiet breath from him that might have been the beginning of a laugh, though it faded quickly as he leaned back against the couch. I set the cloth aside and reached for the small blanket folded over the back of the chair. Here, I said, draping it over his shoulders. Your coat is still damp. Adrian looked down at the blanket as if the gesture surprised him more than anything else that had happened tonight. For a moment, he simply held the fabric between his fingers. Then he nodded once in quiet appreciation. The cabin settled into silence again. Outside the wind moved softly through the trees, and somewhere in the distance a night bird called once before the forest returned to stillness. I poured another small glass of warm water and placed it on the coffee table within Adrian's reach. If you feel dizzy, stay seated, I said. There is a bathroom down the hall, but you should not try to walk alone yet. Adrian followed the direction of my gesture with his eyes, studying the narrow hallway and the closed bedroom door at the end where Ethan slept. Something thoughtful passed across his face then, as if he understood the quiet trust that existed inside this small home. Claire, he said after a moment. I looked up from the first aid kit. Yes. Adrian rested his hands loosely together, the blanket draped across his shoulders, his posture calmer now than when he first arrived. The place where you found me, he said carefully. Did you notice any vehicles nearby? The question hung in the room with a different kind of weight. I shook my head slowly. No cars. No lights. Nothing. Adrian lowered his gaze slightly, as if considering that information. Bruno's ears lifted again at the subtle change in tone. I watched Adrian closely. Why? I asked. Adrian looked up again, and this time the calm confidence in his eyes had returned more clearly. Because, he said quietly, if someone believed I would never leave that place, they may not expect me to still be breathing tonight. The room stayed quiet after Adrian spoke, but the calm inside the cabin no longer felt the same. The words he had chosen were careful, but they carried the weight of something larger than either of us had said out loud. I closed the lid of the first aid kit and set it aside on the coffee table, studying him for a moment. Adrian did not look afraid. If anything, he looked thoughtful, as if he was already several steps ahead in a conversation that had not fully begun yet. Bruno must have sensed the shift too, because he lifted his head again, his eyes moving toward the front window that faced the clearing outside. The night beyond the glass remained dark and still, the porch light casting a faint circle across the gravel driveway. "You think someone might come looking for you?" I said quietly. Adrian did not answer right away. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on his knees, the blanket still draped around his shoulders. "People who make plans like the one you interrupted," he said slowly, "usually expect those plans to stay finished." I considered that. "But you are not finished." A faint line appeared at the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile, but close enough to suggest the idea amused him. "No," he said calmly. "Apparently, I am not." I walked to the small window beside the front door and looked out across the clearing. The trees stood motionless beyond the reach of the porch light. My old pickup truck sat parked beside the cabin exactly where I had left it earlier that morning. Everything looked the same as it always did. Quiet, ordinary, safe. But Adrian's words had changed the way the night felt. I returned to the living room and leaned against the arm of the chair again. "If someone believed you would not survive," I said carefully, "then they probably are not expecting you to be sitting on my couch right now." Adrian nodded once. "That is correct." Bruno rose slowly to his feet and padded across the wooden floor toward the front door, his large body moving with deliberate calm. He stopped there and stood still, ears slightly raised, listening to something neither Adrian nor I could hear. The silence stretched for several seconds before Adrian spoke again. "Your dog hears things before they happen," he said quietly. "That is one of the reasons he is still alive," I replied. Adrian watched Bruno for a moment with renewed interest, then shifted his gaze back toward me. "Claire," he said slowly, "you should understand something." I waited. Adrian's voice remained steady but firm. "If the people responsible for what happened tonight realize I survived, they will not assume I stayed in the woods." The meaning behind that sentence settled heavily in the room. I crossed my arms lightly, thinking it through. "Then they will start looking," I said. Adrian nodded again. Bruno suddenly gave a low rumble deep in his chest. Not loud, but unmistakable. Both Adrian and I turned toward the front door at the same time. The dog stood perfectly still, staring through the dark glass of the window beside the door. My pulse quickened slightly. Outside, the clearing remained empty, but the quiet no longer felt peaceful. It felt watchful. Adrian rose slightly from the couch before remembering his strength had not returned yet and easing back down again. "Tell me something," he said calmly. "How far away is your nearest neighbor?" I met his gaze across the room. "About 2 miles down the road." Adrian nodded slowly, as if confirming something in his mind. Bruno's rumble faded, but he did not step away from the door. I glanced once more toward the dark window. For the first time since bringing Adrian into the cabin, a thought crossed my mind that had not occurred to me before. If the night had already taken such an unexpected turn, there was no guarantee it had finished changing yet. Bruno did not move away from the door. His body stayed perfectly still, his massive shoulders squared toward the dark window, the faint rumble in his chest fading but the tension in his posture remaining. I walked slowly toward him, my boots quiet against the wooden floor. The porch lights still glowed outside, casting a soft circle across the gravel clearing, but the forest beyond that light was nothing but shadow. "What do you hear, boy?" I murmured quietly. Bruno flicked one ear back toward me, but kept his gaze fixed outside. Adrian watched the scene from the couch, his eyes sharp despite the exhaustion still pulling at his posture. "Dogs do not imagine threats," he said calmly. "They notice changes." I rested my hand lightly on Bruno's broad neck, feeling the steady warmth beneath his thick skin. The night outside remained silent, but Adrian's words made me pay closer attention to the small details. The wind had slowed. The trees were barely moving now. Even the usual nighttime insects seemed quieter than before. After a few seconds, Bruno relaxed slightly and lowered his head, though he remained near the door. I exhaled slowly and turned back toward the living room. Adrian had shifted again, sitting a little straighter than before. The blanket still rested around his shoulders, but his posture carried more strength now. "You are recovering quickly," I said. Adrian gave a small shrug. "I have experienced worse nights." I studied him for a moment. That sounds like a story. His gaze drifted briefly toward the window before returning to me. It is not one that belongs in your living room. I accepted that answer without pressing further. Instead, I walked to the small shelf near the stove and poured 2 cups of tea from the kettle that had remained warm. When I returned, Adrian accepted the cup with a quiet nod. The steam curled upward between us, carrying the simple scent of chamomile. For a moment, the scene almost felt normal again. Just 2 adults sitting in a quiet cabin while a child slept down the hall and a dog guarded the door. But the night outside reminded me that normal had already disappeared hours ago. Adrian held the cup between his hands, absorbing the warmth. "Claire," he said slowly after a moment, "when you decided to help me, did you consider that it might place you in danger?" I leaned back into the chair across from him. "Of course I did." His eyes narrowed slightly with curiosity. "Yet you still brought me here." I nodded once. "Because leaving you there would have been worse." Adrian studied my face carefully, as if measuring the truth in that answer. Finally, he gave a faint nod of his own. "You are either very brave or very stubborn." I smiled slightly. Those 2 qualities tend to look the same. Bruno shifted his weight near the door and lay down again, though his eyes remained open. The cabin returned to quiet. Outside, the clearing remained empty beneath the porch light. Adrian took another slow sip of tea before speaking again. "People often believe power comes from control," he said thoughtfully. "But tonight control belonged to a dog and a woman who refused to look away." I tilted my head slightly. That sounds like something a man says after surviving something he did not expect. Adrian met my gaze steadily. "That is exactly what happened." For a few seconds we sat in silence again. Then I asked the question that had been sitting quietly in the back of my mind since I pulled him from the ground. "Adrian," I said calmly, "who would want you to disappear like that?" The room grew still again as the words settled between us. Adrian looked toward the dark window once more before answering, his voice quiet but certain. "Someone who believed removing me would change the balance of a very large game." Adrian's answer settled into the quiet room like a stone dropped into still water. Neither of us spoke for a few seconds after he said it. The heater hummed softly near the wall, pushing warm air across the floor while the porch light outside continued to glow through the window. Bruno remained beside the door, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes still open, watching the dark clearing beyond the glass. I studied Adrian carefully. The way he spoke about power and balance did not sound like someone describing an ordinary disagreement. It sounded like the kind of conflict that lived in places far removed from quiet cabins and gravel roads. "That is a very large problem to carry into a small house," I said finally. Adrian did not look offended. If anything, he seemed to respect the honesty. "You did not invite the problem," he replied calmly. "You simply interrupted it." I leaned back slightly in the chair and folded my hands together. "Then let us hope whoever started it does not come knocking at my door tonight." Adrian considered that possibility without panic. His gaze drifted toward the window again, as if measuring the distance between the world outside and the quiet room we sat in. "If they believed I was gone," he said slowly, "they will not move quickly. People who think they have already won rarely hurry." I absorbed that thought. It made sense in a strange way. If someone had gone to the trouble of leaving him buried out there, they probably felt confident the situation was finished. Adrian took another sip of tea and then set the cup carefully on the coffee table. The simple movement seemed to signal that his strength had returned a little more. "Still," he added quietly, "the fact that I am sitting here changes things." Bruno shifted slightly at that moment, lifting his head and glancing toward Adrian before returning his attention to the door. I noticed Adrian watching the dog again with thoughtful curiosity. "He trusts you," Adrian said. "Animals notice intentions before words." I glanced at Bruno and smiled faintly. "Bruno trusts people who breathe slowly and do not make sudden moves. You have done both since you arrived." Adrian acknowledged that with a small nod. The room returned to silence again for a moment, the kind of calm that settles in after a storm. Passes, but before anyone is certain the sky will remain clear. My eyes drifted toward the hallway where Ethan slept. The soft light from the lamp barely reached the doorframe. Everything down that hall remained peaceful. "Tomorrow," I said slowly, "you will probably need to contact someone who knows you are alive." Adrian's expression shifted slightly at that suggestion. Not resistance, just careful thought. "Yes," he said after a moment. There are people who will need to hear that news. I tilted my head slightly. Friends. Adrian looked at the floor for a brief second before answering. Allies, he said calmly. The word carried a different tone than the one I expected. I noticed it, but did not press further. Instead, I stood and carried the empty teacups back toward the kitchen sink. The ordinary sound of running water filled the cabin for a moment before I turned back toward the living room. Adrian remained seated exactly where he had been, though his shoulders looked stronger now than when he first arrived. You should rest, I told him gently. Your body still needs it. Adrian looked up at me with steady eyes. And you? I shrugged lightly. I sleep lightly. That is part of being a parent. Adrian nodded slowly, as if he understood that more than he expected. Bruno lifted his head once more, glancing between us before settling again beside the door. The night outside remained quiet, but the strange feeling from earlier had not completely faded. Adrian followed my gaze toward the window and spoke again, his voice calm but thoughtful. Claire, he said slowly. Tonight began with someone trying to erase me. He paused briefly before finishing the thought. But thanks to you and that dog, tomorrow will begin very differently. The cabin grew quieter after Adrian said that. The heater hummed softly against the wall, pushing warm air through the small living room while the night outside remained still and dark. I dried the teacups and set them beside the sink before turning back toward him. Adrian had leaned slightly farther into the couch, the blanket still around his shoulders, though the tension that had followed him inside earlier had eased a little. Bruno had not moved from his place near the door. His heavy body rested across the floorboards like a living barrier between the cabin and whatever waited outside in the trees. For a moment, I simply stood there, looking at the two of them and thinking about how strange the night had become. 12 hours earlier, my biggest concern had been finishing paperwork after my shift and getting Ethan home before bedtime. Now a man who spoke about power and balance like chess pieces was sitting on my couch after being pulled from the ground by my dog. Life had a way of changing direction without warning. Adrian seemed to read part of that thought on my face. You are still trying to decide if helping me was a mistake, he said quietly. I shook my head slowly. No, I replied. I am trying to decide how tomorrow is going to look. Adrian watched me with calm attention. Tomorrow will begin with a conversation, he said. One that should have happened hours ago. I walked back toward the chair across from him and sat down again. With those allies you mentioned. Adrian nodded once. Yes. The porch light outside flickered slightly as the wind brushed the edge of the clearing, casting a faint shifting glow through the window. For a brief second, Bruno lifted his head and listened again, but whatever he noticed seemed harmless this time, because he relaxed almost immediately. Adrian followed that small exchange with interest before returning his gaze to me. Your dog saved my life tonight, he said. But you made the decision that allowed it to matter. I considered that. Bruno finds things, I said. I just try not to ignore what he finds. Adrian's expression softened slightly, the hard edge of the night giving way to something more reflective. People in my world ignore many things, he said. Sometimes that is how they lose everything. The statement carried more meaning than the words alone suggested. I did not ask him to explain it. Some stories needed time before they were ready to be told. Instead, I stood and walked to the front door, placing my hand lightly against the frame as I looked through the glass at the quiet clearing. The forest beyond remained dark and endless, the same as it had been every night since Ethan and I moved out here. Yet tonight it felt different, as if something important had quietly stepped into our lives without knocking first. I turned back toward the living room. Adrian had closed his eyes for a moment, resting while he could. Bruno remained beside the door, watchful but calm. The house felt steady again. Safe, at least for now. Get some sleep, I told Adrian gently. Morning will come faster than either of us expects. Adrian opened his eyes again and gave a small nod. His voice was quieter now, but the certainty inside it had not changed. Claire, he said slowly. Tonight you gave a man back the future he was supposed to lose. I met his gaze across the room. Then tomorrow you should use it carefully, I replied. Adrian studied me for one more thoughtful second before leaning back against the couch. Outside the cabin, the wind moved softly through the trees, and somewhere far down the dark road the first faint hint of dawn was beginning to gather beyond the horizon.